Fresh violence in the West Bank caps off a series of attacks in Israel and the Palestinian territories over the past several weeks. The violence has many, including the United Nations, fearing a third Palestinian Intifada. Joining us now for their views in Washington, D.C., Khalid El-Gindi, a fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute, and with us here in studio, Yoni Goldstein, editor-in-chief at the Canadian Jewish News. A welcome to both of you for being on our program tonight. Khalid, let's start with you. What, in your view, is driving the violence over these last several weeks?
Well, at the very root cause of this violence, of course, is the Israeli occupation, which has been now going on for almost half a century. And that includes East Jerusalem. And actually in East Jerusalem, where most of the attacks are coming and where most of the Palestinian protests are happening, East Jerusalem is sort of unique in its form of occupation in that it's cut off from the rest of the West Bank, including the Palestinian Authority, and it doesn't receive basic services from Israel. Israel has shut down Palestinian institutions there. There are, well-documented discriminatory practices against Palestinians in Jerusalem. And so Jerusalemites, Palestinians in Jerusalem, feel very much abandoned by their own leadership and by the so-called peace process.
These attacks are obviously not organized in large groups. They seem to be one-offs, and yet they seem to be mirroring each other over and over and over. Any speculation as to why that would be?
Well, I think what we're seeing, these knifing attacks, fortunately, as terrible as they are, fortunately, at least they're not using firearms. We've seen that in the past. So at least there isn't that escalation at this point. Again, I think you have to put this into context. The attacks on Israeli civilians, which are abhorrent and tragic, are not the norm. What is mostly happening, and most of the Palestinian anger, is being expressed in mass protests in Jerusalem, in parts of the West Bank, and even among Palestinian citizens of Israel. So the occasional attack is really the exception. What is not exceptional, however, is Israel's very violent response, in which it uses live ammunition against unarmed protesters. And so that's the other side of this that really isn't getting a lot of play. You have more than 50 Palestinians who have been killed. Not all of them, in fact, a majority of them, are not attackers or stabbers or would-be terrorists. They're simply, most of them are simply protesters who are not armed or who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Okay, Yoni Goldstein, let me go to you and find out, in your view, why have these recent attacks increased in number over the last several weeks?
Okay, well, I agree that in part that the settlement issue is at play here. It's always at issue. But, we can't forget what the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said last month. He alleged that Israel was planning to change the status quo on the Temple Mount, the rules that have governed who is allowed to go on the Temple Mount, when, and what they're allowed to do there for 40 plus years now. Abbas suggested that Israel was planning to change the rules, and the implication there is that more Jews would be allowed up. They would be allowed to pray, which they are not allowed to do now. And frankly, it's completely untrue. None of that has been planned. There are no indications of sort. The Israeli government has gone out of its way to say that there are no planned changes to the status quo. In fact, they've agreed to install new security cameras on the Temple Mount. That was part of an agreement with Jordan. The Palestinian Authority has said they don't want those, or they've complained that they think it's a bad idea. So while the settlement policy is always going to be an issue, let's not forget that this latest round started after a blatant lie was issued by the Palestinian Authority president.
So are you blaming President Abbas for inciting the violence that has taken place?
I think everybody can take some blame, but I think Abbas has to take a fair share of it, yeah.
How much is a fair share?
I would say the majority of it at this point.
The lion's share, in your view. Khalid El-Gindi, you want to come back on that? Is there any culpability here on the part of the Palestinian leadership?
Certainly there is. I think, as Yoni said, all sides clearly are not without blame. But you have to look at the sequence of events. These protests started before Mahmoud Abbas said anything, and in fact, Mahmoud Abbas desperately would like these protests to end. He has no control over these very angry young people. And so the minimum that he can do is try to appease them somehow by sounding tough or sort of playing up the rhetoric in populist terms or nationalist terms. And so that's really a response on his part, but it's certainly not what's driving this. It's not what started the violence. The trigger may have been these provocations by Israeli extremists who, every year they come and they make sort of these gestures that they want to, come up and pray. But what's different now is you have an Israeli government that is very much along the same sort of mindset as the extremist Israeli settlers. And you have Israeli cabinet ministers like Uri Ariel, who says openly that the third temple ought to be built. What is implicit in that, of course, is that it would be built in place of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so even if there aren't plans per se to allow Jewish prayer or to change the status quo arrangement in the holy places in Jerusalem, there are plenty of signs and plenty of precedent in that direction. And so it's not completely absurd for Palestinians to think that there is an encroachment on their holy place. We've seen a similar process happen in Hebron, this kind of creeping annexation and encroachment by extremist settlers who now control the very heart of a Palestinian city in the West Bank. And Palestinians fear that that is happening. And so it is, we have to keep things in perspective. Who has power in this arrangement and who doesn't? The Israelis are the much more powerful party in this, and they can and have changed the situation on the ground quite dramatically. And so it's not an irrational fear that Palestinians have, that they're worried about further encroachment on their holy places and their livelihoods and their property.
Okay, Yoni Goldstein, anything you want to respond to there? Or because I have something else to go on to, unless you have a response.
Well, yes, I think Khaled made an interesting point about Abbas's ability to control the situation among the Palestinians, and he's very right. Abbas is in a very difficult spot, and the question is who's put him in that spot. I'm sure some people would say the Israelis have put him in that spot. I'd argue that, at least in part, he's put himself there. He is effectively powerless at this point, and he's made a number of indications in the last few weeks and months that he intends to step down from power. So on the one hand, he's able to incite in some ways what the violence that's happening, but he has very little control over it because he's effectively coming to his retirement very soon.
Okay, but you say Abbas has the lion's share or bears the lion's share of responsibility for the recent spate of violence in the region. He's also had some fairly controversial things to say. For example, any blood spilled in defense of the Temple Mount is pure. May not have been helpful either. However, let's look at the other side of the coin. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has also made his share of controversial statements lately, and I want to get into that. The claim that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem gave Adolf Hitler the idea to incinerate the Jews of Europe rather than just expel them is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu alleged over the past couple of weeks. And here's how Abbas responded to those comments at the United Nations Human Rights Council on Wednesday. He said, when the Israeli Prime Minister tries to absolve Adolf Hitler from his ugly crimes against the Jews and blame Palestinians for these crimes, he is trying thereby to justify the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. What's your view, Yoni, on the advisability of what the Israeli Prime Minister had to say?
I think, frankly, it was a terrible mistake. I'm really not sure how it happened. You would think that whoever wrote that speech, whoever vetted that speech, and Mr. Netanyahu himself knows the correct history. And the history is not that the Grand Mufti somehow inspired the final solution, the Nazi final solution. This was Hitler's plan all along. They did have conversations, the Grand Mufti and Hitler, but Netanyahu's understanding of history, at least as it was played in that speech, is completely wrong. And you've had many leaders in the Jewish community and in Israel speak out against it, including the chief historian at Yad Vashem, which is dedicated to upholding Holocaust history. So it was a massive mistake. I have no idea how it happened, and I also don't know why there hasn't been an apology yet.
Yeah, there's no question the Grand Mufti was a sympathizer to Hitler, but surely the Israeli Prime Minister knows his history better than that, doesn't he?
I would think so, yes.
Would think so. Okay, let's, Khalid, do you want a word on that? Or, I mean, I think it's been said, but if you want a word, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I of course completely agree. You know, it wasn't surprising at all to see that historians and Holocaust survivors and others sort of excoriated the Israeli Prime Minister for what were just very factually inaccurate statements. But we have to look at the deeper reasons. Why is he saying this, and why now in this context? And I think, you know, it seems pretty clear that, you know, after all, the Mufti's been dead for more than 40 years, so it's not someone who could be tried or held accountable in some way. But it really is, I think, a way to delegitimize and even dehumanize Palestinians and their struggle. That this is you know, sort of promoting the perspective that this is an irrational, crazy, fanatical movement bent on destroying Jews. As opposed to an occupied population that has legitimate grievances and strives for freedom the same way any people does.
Okay, let's try to understand, Yoni, the nature of what's happening right now in terms of these knife attacks in the region. Are you prepared to say that what we are seeing now is the beginnings of a third Palestinian Intifada?
I don't think you can say that. I mean, first of all, look, there have been some attacks today on Friday, but there hadn't been any attacks for almost a week beforehand, maybe even more than a week, I'm not entirely sure. So I'm not sure you can really call it that yet. There are some indications that it might get to that level. I think it would be in all parties' interest to keep it from getting there, and there's still a chance to do that.
I mean, the previous intifadas had a theme, right, of a particular grievance followed by a response, be it slingshots, be it whatever. There's clearly a theme to these attacks, right? These are repeat knifings.
Yes.
So why does that to you not look like some kind of thematic response to what's happening?
Well, look, I think, you know, you've seen about 60 total terror attacks by some accounts in the last month or so. That's obviously very worrying. And you're right, there is a theme. These knife attacks. You know, we see pictures of bloody knives standing on, you know, lying on the street, and you start to think that this is what's going to keep on happening. I'm not sure yet that it will actually keep on happening, and we've seen some lulls in it, and you just got to hope at this point that the lulls will continue to get longer.
Do you think the government's response, the defense security establishment's response to these knifings has been adequate so far?
I think so. The truth is, I'm really not sure what you can do other than put more security personnel on the ground, you know, on street corners, at bus stops, at light rail stops, in front of shopping centers and bus stations. There isn't a ton more you can do at this point. It's a very difficult offense to defend against. These are concealed weapons. They can be brought out very quickly. They're not easily detected. Right now, all you can do is have more feet on the ground and just vigilance, and that also extends to citizens themselves. You hear reports of Israelis stocking up on pepper spray. There have been more gun permits handed out in the last month than in many years. I think you're seeing Israelis are fearful. They're arming themselves. That in itself is something to be worried about. But you just hope that it doesn't come to anything further than that.
Khalid, in your view, are we seeing the beginnings of a third Intifada?
I think it's probably premature to call it that just yet, because when you say a third Intifada, it implies something that is much more massive. That can be sustained over a long period of time, and you know, obviously time will tell. I don't personally think that the pieces are in place for sort of a sustained mass mobilization that would last, you know, a year or two or more, as we've seen in the past. But it is certainly an uprising of sorts. It is a rebellion, and it is a sentiment that is shared by all Palestinians. But in a way, I think it's worse because for the reasons that Yoni and others have pointed out, when you have this kind of very unpredictable, ad hoc, almost random violence by individuals, not inspired by groups, not coordinated between groups, it's much more difficult to address, because ultimately, if you have a third intifada with political groups that are engaged, then you have an address. There are political demands that are being articulated, and you have a political address that you can either threaten, punish, negotiate with, or otherwise deal with, and you don't have that here. So in a lot of ways, I think a third intifada would be much better for everyone, in that it has a very, there would be a clear political path out of it. But I would also disagree that the Israeli response has been effective. It's not been effective. It's been very repressive, and it has been almost as random in its violence as the knifing attacks, except far more deadly in terms of the number of Palestinian casualties. Again, this speaks to the power differential. Israel has arrested hundreds of Palestinians, basically just sort of mass arrests and rounding people up. It has shot into crowds of unarmed protesters. There is a sort of shoot-to-kill policy that appears to be the main rules of engagement for Israeli security forces, where they shoot first and ask questions later. And we saw just the other day, the Israeli police conducted an investigation into a Palestinian woman who was shot in the city of Afula, and they found that she was in fact not carrying any weapons, that the initial reports that she had a knife were false, and that she was just simply executed for no reason. There's a real fear that is gripping Israelis, but it needs to be sort of put in perspective and not allowed to sort of spiral out of control. Fear can do a lot of damage, and sort of retaliatory or reflexive types of responses, I think, are not going to be constructive, and in fact, they are probably going to fuel Palestinian anger.
Yoni, you want to respond?
I think Khaled makes a lot of very good points. The Israeli government's response and the Israeli security personnel response. Look, it's a difficult situation. In some cases they have used live fire. In many cases they haven't. They've used rubber bullets and they've used tear gas. And a lot of the so-called unarmed protesters are lobbing Molotov cocktails. They're throwing stones and cinder blocks. You've got people who are trying to drive on the highways in Israel. They're having things thrown at them constantly, and we've seen people have been murdered on those highways at point blank range in front of their kids. So I don't think the situation. I don't think a lot of these protesters are as unarmed as some people have put them out to be.
Let me ask. We've got just a few minutes left here, and I want to ask about the players. For those who thought that maybe peace had a better shot if the players would change, we're, I guess, quite disappointed by the fact that Mahmoud Abbas is he 80 yet? If he's not 80, he's approaching it, and he's still there. And Benjamin Netanyahu won his last election in part through some, rather controversial language about, get out there and vote because the Arabs are voting in droves and so on. You've got the two same people in the two same jobs that have resulted in a complete lack of progress on peace for a long time. Why shouldn't we be hopeless about this, Yoni?
Well, look, Netanyahu has been around for a long time. He has the ability to change his tune, and he has done it various times over the course of his leadership. A week or two ago, he invited the Labour Party, who are the main opposition in the government, to join him in a unity government. That hasn't happened yet. I'm not sure it will happen. There might be larger political implications at play for the Israeli left here. But I think there are some Israelis and many Palestinians who would say that if there was a more peace-oriented government in place and leadership in place, that there might be something to do. I'd say the same thing on the Palestinian side. It's difficult to envision any sort of movement toward peace and security while Mr. Abbas is still in power. there's a massive risk when he leaves power. Who will ascend after him? Will it be somebody who's more interested in peace or not? And that's a risk that will eventually have to be taken. It's probably for sooner than later would be for the better for everybody.
Khalid, in our last minute, could you respond to the notion that the yardsticks on peace aren't going to move at all as long as these two players are still in place?
I think that's largely true, and I would actually throw in a third player, and that's the United States. Leadership really is lacking across the board. So we've got failed leadership, certainly on the Palestinian side, which is extremely weak, a very weak and divided and dysfunctional leadership. On the Israeli side, you have quite the opposite, triumphal, sort of overly successful, very politicized, very ideological government in place that is frankly not interested in a two-state solution, and they've said so quite explicitly. And then you have the United States' role, which has been, primarily to steward this process, and they've dropped the ball. They haven't addressed the real core issues that are in this conflict. It's not enough to facilitate meetings between two sides. You need to actually use the leverage that you have as the world's only superpower to sort of produce some results. But I think it's important to point out that I don't agree with Yoni that Abbas's departure would make it more likely to see peace. Actually, quite the opposite. Mahmoud Abbas is probably the most pro-peace, anti-violence, pro-two-state solution Palestinian leader, pro-security coordination with Israel that any Israeli government could ever hope for. So if he's gone, the likelihood of getting anyone as pliant, as flexible, as willing to compromise, as willing to coordinate with Israeli security as he has been, I think are extremely unlikely. So really, it's Mahmoud Abbas is the last best hope, as unfortunate as that may be. He's the last best hope really for a two-state solution. But the problem is really on the Israeli side, which is frankly, the government is not interested in a peace settlement with the Palestinians.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid that's our time, but we thank you both for coming on TVO tonight and helping us understand this a bit better. Khalid El-Gindi, Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Yoni Goldstein, Canadian Jewish News here in Toronto. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.